They called it a one-on-one, but I knew what it really was the moment I saw the calendar invite. No agenda, no attachments, just touch base. 10 a.m. from Jared Cole, our new CEO. I've been in the corporate world long enough to know when the axe is coming, and that morning it had my name engraved on the blade. My name's Elliot Granger. I'm 62 years old, and up until that Tuesday, I was the Chief Financial Officer of Hollingsworth Dynamics. 15 years in that office. I'd survived 2 acquisitions, a proxy fight, and a liquidity crisis that should have buried us. When I joined, we were a mid-sized parts manufacturer with barely 4 facilities. When I left, we were international with streamlined supply chains and our first dividend in company history. I wasn't flashy. I didn't wear slim-fit suits or network at rooftop bars, but the numbers were always clean. The audits passed, the books balanced. No drama, just results. That's not what Jared wanted. He was 36, all buzzwords and bravado. The board brought him in from a VC-backed logistics startup that burned through cash faster than it could raise it. Still, he had the right friends, the right smile, the right spin. On his first day, he told the company we were entering a transformational era. On his third, he ordered a $30,000 mural for the lobby. That should have told me everything. When I stepped into my office, he was already sitting in my chair, feet on my desk, flipping through a printout of last quarter's financials like they were a flyer for a summer sale. "Elliot," he said, not looking up, "you've done great work, really. But we need a CFO who can align with the vision." I said nothing. He leaned back, grinning like this was just a conversation between buddies. "You're just a little too old school for where we're headed. We need someone who can innovate." "Who's replacing me?" I asked. Calm. Neutral. He blinked, surprised by my lack of protest. "Noah Spence, 29, absolute genius. Did a TEDx talk on blockchain and financial agility. It's going viral." I nodded once. "When's the transition?" 2 weeks, he said, hesitating like he'd expected me to fight. "We'll announce it at next Monday's town hall." "Understood," I replied. I stood, extended my hand. He shook it, probably thinking I was too stunned to react. Then I walked out. No speeches, no box of donuts in the break room, no bitter farewell email, just a quiet exit through the side hallway while the rest of the company sat in that very same town hall clapping along to a slideshow about Vision 2.0. My office held 15 years of my life, and everything fit in one box. A framed picture of Patricia and me at the old lake house, a set of cufflinks from the board when we went public, and the leather portfolio Patricia gave me on the day I signed with Hollingsworth. "You always look forward," she'd written inside, "but remember what you've built." She passed 3 years ago. Cancer. Fast. Unforgiving. I haven't opened that portfolio since. As I walked toward the elevator, I saw Maya standing nearby, her arms crossed tight, eyes rimmed red. She'd been with the company almost as long as I had, senior accounting manager, tough as nails, loyal to a fault. She tried to smile, but failed. "They didn't even give you a goodbye," she whispered. I gave her a soft nod. It's all part of the cycle. What I didn't tell her, what I hadn't told anyone, was that I'd been watching things shift under Jared's tenure for months. Vendor invoices that didn't match deliverables, contracts rushed through procurement, budget lines that had no signatures attached, nothing provable, not yet. But it had a smell. The kind of smell you learn to notice after decades in finance. I wasn't planning revenge. I was just doing my job, even as they walked me out. The funny thing about fraud is it doesn't come with sirens. There's no dramatic music, no red lights flashing above someone's head. It slips in quietly through a line item, a fast-tracked invoice, a missing approval signature. The first one came 2 weeks before Jared's first board update. A $47,000 payment to a vendor I'd never seen, Marcon Strategies, supposedly for executive communication consulting. No department head signed off, no statement of work attached. When I flagged it with procurement, the director shrugged. Jared said to push it through, said it was urgent. The second came from Noah. He announced a finance realignment that rerouted all monthly budget reports through his office before they reached the CEO or the board. "You'll still review them," he assured me. Eventually, that's when I knew. This wasn't incompetence, it was insulation. And if there's one thing I've learned over 40 years in finance, it's that people only shield themselves when they've got something to hide. I didn't blow the whistle. I didn't march into the boardroom waving spreadsheets. That's not my style. I believe in numbers, in structure, in letting the facts speak for themselves, even if no one's listening yet. Patricia used to call me a turtle slow but damn near indestructible. She was the fire. I was the stone. She believed in storming the gates. I preferred blueprints, and I always had one. My father owned a hardware store in Riverbend, Kentucky. Tiny place, 3 aisles, cash-only register until the late 90s. I did the books in the back room starting when I was 15. He taught me 2 things that stuck. If you can't explain a number in plain English, you don't understand it. Numbers don't lie, people do. Those rules built my career. Years ago, 2011, right after the Jackson acquisition, I insisted we install a parallel audit system, a fail-safe. It duplicated every transaction over $50,000 to an off-site encrypted server, just in case. The CIO at the time thought it was paranoid. Patricia called it classic Elliot. I hadn't thought about that server in years. But as I watched Jared and Noah shuffle reporting lines and approve contracts in half the time it used to take, the memory came rushing back like an old code finally being called. Back in the present, things kept stacking. 2 payments to different firms with the same street address. A sudden spike in strategic advisory fees without board-level disclosures. A $93,000 budget reallocation labeled innovation readiness. Maya noticed it too. She came by my office. Well, Noah's office now during lunch one afternoon, looking pale. "Did you approve the Vertex retainer?" she asked quietly. "I didn't approve anything after April," I said. She didn't say anything else, just nodded once and walked away. That night I opened a private spreadsheet I'd started keeping. Tab 1, vendor names. Tab 2, invoice amounts. Tab 3, approval irregularities. Tab 4, Jared Noah links. I didn't know where it was all leading, but I knew it wasn't nothing. You don't need a smoking gun when you've got a trail of ash. And besides, I had time now. No meetings, no reports to prep, no inbox full of urgent calendar invites. All I had was this leather folder and the uncomfortable weight of knowing something was wrong. I didn't want payback, I wanted the truth. And deep down I think I knew whatever I found, it wouldn't just implicate Jared or Noah, it would go deeper, much deeper. There's a moment in every investigation when suspicion hardens into certainty. Not because someone confesses or you stumble onto a secret file marked fraud. It's the moment the patterns stop being scattered dots and start forming lines, lines that trace in only one direction. Mine came at 2:12 on a Thursday afternoon in late October. I was reviewing our third quarter financials when I spotted 2 separate consultant payments, one to Tremont Advisory and one to Virex Systems. $86,000 and $91,000 respectively. Different services supposedly, one for cultural integration, the other for executive behavioral optimization. The invoices were clean, but a little too clean. Generic language, no client-side deliverables. And the weirdest part, both companies listed the same registered agent address and LLC mailbox in Des Moines. That was enough. I emailed Ruben Ortega. Ruben had been with our internal audit team for nearly a decade. Smart, quiet, trusted. We met that evening in the parking garage like we were plotting a heist. He handed me a printout. "I pulled this from the Q3 tech investment log," he said. Noah categorized 3 vendor payments as cloud security licensing, but the amounts don't line up with the volume we ordered. How far off? About 60 grand. Total. I nodded. "You think someone's skimming? I think someone's laundering." Ruben didn't have to say more. We both understood what that meant. He offered to dig deeper, but I shook my head. "No, don't put yourself in the middle. Just keep your reports clean. I'll handle the rest." That night, I couldn't sleep. I made coffee, turned on the porch light, and pulled Patricia's leather folder from my shelf. Inside was the spreadsheet I'd started during the Jackson acquisition. She'd called it my black box, a place where I logged the things I didn't trust to stay visible in the system. She used to tease me for it, said I was more detective than accountant. I opened a new workbook and named it JCNWEB Jared Cole, Noah Spence. Web, tabs formed one by one. Shell vendors, invoice clusters, approval chains, shared addresses, board appointments. By 3:00 a.m., I had 4 vendors using similar naming conventions and mailing addresses, all registered within 60 days of Jared's hire. 2 were tied to a single Delaware holding entity, Cromley Partners, created by a venture firm Jared used to work with. It was starting to look less like rogue spending and more like a system. One designed to move money through layers until no one could trace it. but I could. That weekend, I drove out to the cemetery, brought fresh flowers, sat in front of Patricia's headstone for over an hour. The fall air had that sharp edge, just cold enough to remind you winter's coming. You'd be yelling at me, I said to the granite slab, telling me to take this to the board, raise hell. I could hear her voice in my head. What's the point of principles if they don't mean anything when it matters? I'm not being quiet, I told her. I'm being patient. She'd always known the difference. By Sunday night, I had traced over $400,000 in overlapping charges across 8 consultants, 3 of which had no real presence online. All shared one thing. They were approved either directly by Jared or routed through Noah's streamlined system without full oversight, and none of it had been reviewed by the board. Yet. I didn't want a confrontation. I wasn't out for drama. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I just wanted the truth where it belonged on paper under scrutiny, and eventually in front of someone who couldn't ignore it. For the first time since leaving my office, I felt a sense of direction, not revenge, focus. There was a web forming, and I intended to map every thread. I made one mistake I thought George Finley might care. He'd been chair of the board for the last 6 years, old school businessman. Built his own company from a garage in the 80s and sold it before exit strategy was a buzzword. I figured if anyone on that board would take this seriously, it'd be him. So I called. Just a quiet outreach. I said I had a few concerns about how vendor approvals were being processed under the new leadership. He listened, paused, then gave me the corporate shoulder shrug. Jared has full authority to restructure. You're no longer part of the active leadership team, Elliot. Let the next generation take the wheel. I thanked him, hung up, and sat at my kitchen table for 15 minutes without moving. The words weren't a surprise, but hearing them still hit like a door locking behind you. 3 days later, the email came. Subject: confidentiality obligations reminder from legal deputy at Hollingsworth Dynamics. The tone was neutral, professional. But the subtext was clear as crystal. Any disclosures of confidential information or internal financial data without authorization could constitute a breach of your severance and NDA agreements. I read it twice, then archived it. Let them try. 2 days after that, Ruben stopped answering my texts. We ran into each other by chance at a grocery store of all places. He looked tense, tired. They moved me under Noah, he said without even saying hello. New title, new pay, new reporting structure. Congratulations, I offered cautiously. He gave a hollow laugh. They also had me sign 2 new NDAs. One of them had a section I wasn't allowed to print or save. That told me everything. You're being watched, I said. He nodded. So are you. And, Elliot, they're saying things about your last quarter, that you missed things, that your ethics were slipping. I didn't respond, just looked down at the coffee in my hand and took a slow breath. They weren't just pushing me out. They were rewriting the narrative. I was being painted as the outdated, fading executive who couldn't keep up, whose errors were being cleaned up by the bold new visionaries. I wanted to be furious, but all I felt was cold. They'd underestimated me. When I stepped down, I didn't just pack up my office and walk out the front door. I left behind the framed degrees, the office plant, the coffee mug with "Trust the Math" etched on the side. But before I handed in my badge, I did one last thing. I activated a transition admin account. It was standard protocol for long-term transitions. It would spin one up to give outgoing officers temporary access to handoff documentation, coordinate with replacements, or review final transition materials. Most of the time it expired in 30 days. But I knew how our systems were configured. This one had a 90-day timeout. No one had revoked it. That night I poured myself a glass of bourbon, fired up my home desktop, and logged in to the Hollingsworth internal server. Welcome E. Granger at transition. The doors opened like nothing had changed. Access logs, audit trails, invoice approvals, back-end metadata, internal project folders. I could still see everything. I didn't celebrate, didn't smile, just clicked open a folder titled Q3, Vendor Variance Logs. I started reading. I wasn't angry anymore. I was calculating. There's a difference. The thing about looking too close is once you see it, you can't unsee it. That night, as the Hollingsworth audit server hummed in the background, I sat at my desk with 2 monitors glowing, coffee gone cold, and a growing sense that what I'd stumbled into wasn't just garden variety fraud. It was an operation. I started with Virex Systems. On the surface, it looked like any other boutique consultancy, generic website, abstract mission statement, vague service offerings. But the DNS registration was only 9 months old. The mailing address was a co-working space in Chicago. And when I dug into the corporate filings in Delaware, the real name popped up: Apex Holdings LLC. I'd seen that name before. Apex had funded Jared's old logistics startup, the one that made headlines for reinventing last-mile distribution and quietly collapsed after a failed Series C round. But Apex didn't just fund it, they had controlling equity. I pulled vendor data from the past 6 months. 8 of our highest value consulting contracts, over $2.3 million in total, were funneled through subsidiaries or service vendors, either partially or wholly owned by Apex Holdings. Some were obvious, others were buried 2 or 3 layers deep, masked by regional shell companies with placeholder websites and recycled logos. Then I found NeuroCore Systems, a modest tech vendor we'd supposedly paid for cloud procurement optimization. The payment, $119,000, was routed through Noah's office 3 weeks after his promotion. Delaware filings again. NeuroCore's original articles of incorporation listed 4 founders. One of them, Noah Spence. His name had been removed from the public-facing documents, scrubbed from the website. But the archive snapshots didn't lie. He'd helped start it 3 years ago, then quietly stepped down 2 months before joining Hollingsworth. It wasn't sloppy. It was intentional. This wasn't about padding expenses or cozying up with friendly vendors. This was structured asset extraction, bleeding the company through a cycle of inflated contracts, fake services, and hand-picked shell entities. The board hadn't just failed to stop it. Some of them had helped open the door. 3 members had ties to Apex, including Daniel Cray, appointed just 6 months earlier. His nephew was Apex's current managing partner. Now it made sense. Why George Finley shrugged off my warnings. Why the legal team sent warnings instead of questions. Why Jared and Noah had swept in like they already owned the place. Because they did. I stared at the screen, numb. Not from shock, more like the stillness you feel when your brain is assembling too many pieces at once. Every ethical alarm bell in my head was blaring. But under that focus, I opened my external drive and started copying. Vendor logs, approval records, email metadata, LLC link maps, Delaware filings. I created redundancy folders and uploaded each to separate encrypted cloud storage buckets I'd used during prior audits. Then I opened the system log and reviewed recent internal access timestamps. Noah had pulled procurement records earlier that morning, likely tying up loose ends. Someone was watching the right doors. But they'd left one open, and I was inside. At 5:44 a.m., as the sun cracked over the Cincinnati skyline, I paused to rest my eyes. The numbers were right there. They'd been screaming the whole time. Now it was up to me to make sure the right people heard them. This wasn't about ego anymore. This was about survival, mine and the company's. The call came at 9:42 a.m. Blocked number. I almost didn't pick up. Mr. Elliot Granger speaking. This is Vanessa Rice with the Securities and Exchange Commission, Enforcement Division. My stomach clenched. For a full second, I thought maybe they were coming after me. We've received an anonymous tip, she continued, about possible financial misconduct at Hollingsworth Dynamics involving its current leadership team. The documents we received suggest you might have relevant knowledge. I leaned back in my chair, kept my voice even. I left the company 6 weeks ago. We're aware. Would you be open to speaking informally off the record for now? Who else knows you're calling? No one outside my team. This isn't a formal inquiry yet. That word yet hung in the air like a lit fuse. Give me some time, I said. I want to make sure I get this right, because now I knew someone else was watching, which meant I was out of time. If Jared or Noah had even a whiff that federal eyes were turning toward Hollingsworth, they'd start wiping traces, or worse, making people disappear. Not literally maybe, but professionally. Quiet reassignments, mysterious contract terminations, files that somehow never existed. I couldn't let that happen. That night, I built the failsafe. First, I backed up everything to 3 different encrypted cloud servers under aliases. Then, I burned copies to 2 physical drives. One I left in a safety deposit box, the other with my lawyer. Finally, I set up a dead man switch. Every 48 hours, I had to enter a rotating code into a secure server. If I missed the window, a packet of evidence, everything would auto-send to the SEC, DOJ, and 3 financial journalists I trusted. That gave me some breathing room. Barely. Next, I turned to the board. Not all of them were compromised. I knew that. You can always spot the true believers, the ones who ask real questions even when it's unpopular. Elaine Monroe, Audit Committee Chair. Jasper Lynn, former COO of a rival firm. Linda Hayes, who represented the Employee Pension Fund. I drafted 3 separate emails. No accusations, no grandstanding. Just calmly presented evidence vendor overlaps, payment trails, and unverified expenditures that had bypassed audit. I included 3 charts and 1 question. Would you feel confident signing off on this during your next shareholder call? I scheduled them to auto-send 48 hours later. Then I called Maya. She didn't hesitate. Met me at a diner near the old plant off Broad Street. They're gutting the department, she whispered over coffee. Noah calls it a lean finance model. Half the team's been reassigned or told to reapply, including me. Because of what you know, I said. Because I might notice, she corrected. They're consolidating everything under Noah's approval chain. I paused. Then asked, do you remember the dual audit protocol we built after the Jackson deal? She blinked. The parallel pathway, the one that logs transactions over 50 grand to the mirrored server. That one. Is it still running? She frowned. Far as I know, yeah, it's hard-coded. You'd have to deliberately go into the back end to kill it. And who can access it now? Me, and the senior audit team. I guess Noah too, technically. What about the backup archives? Still go to Iron Mountain. Automated. First of every month. That was it. October's backups were already gone, sealed, and stored. Untouchable. Even if they wiped everything today, the record would still exist. I reached into my coat and slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a formal complaint letter pre-filled with language that matched her scope of access and whistleblower rights. If you file this, I said, they legally can't fire you without triggering protections. It forces internal audit to investigate, and it creates an official timestamp they can't ignore. She stared at it, then straightened her shoulders. When tomorrow morning, she nodded once. Copy. As I walked back to my car, I checked my phone. 1 new message from Ruben, Z, asking about old audit protocols. Seems nervous. Watch yourself. I looked up at the sky. They were starting to realize they'd missed something. Me. At 8:12 a.m., the machine started humming. Maya submitted her whistleblower complaint to internal audit, citing discrepancies in vendor documentation, authorization patterns, and unverified consulting fees, all within the scope of her role. It was clean, factual, and precisely targeted. By 9:30 a.m., my scheduled emails were delivered to Elaine, Jasper, and Linda. Each one was polite, measured, tethered entirely to the numbers. No accusations, just patterns, irregularities, questions. These transactions are worth a second look. I'm available to assist any third-party review. At 10:47 a.m., my phone buzzed. Maya Elaine just called emergency board meeting. Audit chair protocol. At 11:03, another ping. Maya external auditors arrived, taking over main conference room. I was at the river by then. Same walking trail Patricia and I used to visit on weekends when we didn't feel like driving to the lake. Cool breeze, slow water. The city skyline looked so different now, like a theater set I'd already stepped off. By noon, it was no longer whispers. The entire executive suite was on lockdown. Phones were being confiscated for review, laptops imaged, access cards suspended. Maya and Noah pulled into HR with legal, red in the face, Jared pacing like a trapped fox. A third-party firm, one I'd recommended years ago, was back in our offices conducting a forensic review, this time, not at my request, but because the right people were finally listening. Elaine had done exactly what I hoped. As audit chair, she exercised her authority to freeze discretionary spending, pull contract files, and call an emergency vote for executive suspension pending review. The doors that Jared and Noah thought were locked had been open the whole time. By 3:45 p.m., I had 5 missed calls, 2 from Jared, 1 from George Finley, 1 from Linda Hayes, probably the only one who wasn't furious, and 1 from an unknown number I assumed was Apex's legal. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I watched a barge drift down the Ohio, slow and heavy and unstoppable. They'd never seen me coming, because they assumed I was done. Just another legacy exec shuffled out with a pat on the back and a whisper behind the scenes about being resistant to change. They thought quiet meant weak. but quiet is tactical. At 5:06 p.m., the final message came in from Maya. Maya board issued admin leave for Jared Noah and anyone tied to Apex contracts, forensic audit full scope. You did it, Elliot. Also, Elaine wants to talk. Acting chair now. George resigned. I smiled, not out of pride, out of relief. It was over. The call from Elaine came the next morning. Her voice was calmer than I expected, but with a layer of exhaustion I recognized too well. Elliot, she said I owe you more than one apology. You were right. About all of it. I didn't gloat. I just listened. George has stepped down, she continued. Jasper and Linda are with me. We voted last night to terminate Jared and Noah for cause. 3 other board members tied to Apex have resigned. And the company, we're still breathing. Barely, she hesitated. We need someone who understands what got us here, just for the transition. Help the forensic team, stabilize the foundation. I'll help, I said, but I'm not coming back. May I ask why? Because the company needs someone who can innovate, I replied, smiling to myself. She laughed, tired but real. 3 months passed in a blur. I worked side by side with the forensic team. Quiet, clinical, thorough. No interviews, no press, no statements. That wasn't my style, and thankfully it wasn't Elaine's either. The scope was even broader than I'd expected. 12.7 million. That was the total siphoned through false vendors, inflated contracts, and disguised consulting fees over 14 months. Enough to crater a department, maybe a division, if it hadn't been caught. Jared and Noah were charged with wire fraud conspiracy and securities violations. Apex was investigated for corporate infiltration practices. The SEC negotiated a settlement with Hollingsworth governance reforms, oversight measures, financial penalties. No clawbacks from employees or long-term shareholders. Maya's pension stayed safe. Speaking of Maya, she got the promotion. Director of Accounting. Her message came on a Tuesday evening as I packed up my house in Cincinnati. Maya, we're rebuilding. Properly. New CEO is an operations lifer. Real numbers guy. Thanks for fighting the way you did. Also, I finally get your obsession with parallel audit trails. I laughed. Replied, never underestimate a good backup. 2 weeks later, I unlocked the door to my cabin in Asheville, North Carolina. 2 bedrooms, 1 office, a wraparound porch overlooking the Blue Ridge. Patricia and I had talked about this place for years. She always said, we'll need somewhere quiet, not to hide, just to rest. I never made time when she was alive. Now I did. The settlement Hollingsworth offered for my consulting support during the audit was generous. Paid for the cabin in full. Left more than enough to live simply. I didn't announce my retirement, didn't post a goodbye on LinkedIn. Just disappeared. Let them keep chasing titles and trend reports. Let them measure innovation in buzzwords. I preferred numbers. I always had. That night I sat on the back deck as the sky darkened cool mountain air slipping past the trees. I opened Patricia's old leather portfolio and pulled out our last photo together summer before her diagnosis. We were standing on the edge of a lake. Her hand was on my shoulder. She was laughing. You were right, I whispered. I should have made more time for views like this. Tomorrow, I'd meet with the director of a local nonprofit. They needed help untangling their books after a messy year of turnover. Nothing flashy, just clean, honest accounting for people trying to do something good. Some folks would call that old school. I just call it integrity.